Let's dive straight in. What's tip number 1, please, Jade?
Okay, so my first tip is that we should use explicit instruction for novice learners, and I'll just go into a bit of more depth on that. So first of all, I'll go through what I mean by explicit instruction, and by that I mean when pupils are fully guided through the learning process, when the learning process is really teacher-led. And I mean that for teaching pupils new knowledge or new content and new skills. And I suppose the easiest way to think about it is it's the opposite of discovery learning, where we might require pupils to discover new knowledge or skills for themselves. And then I'll quickly go through what I mean by novice learner, because it's something that I always get asked when I do a session on explicit instruction. So a novice learner is a learner that doesn't have a large amount of background knowledge on the topic that they're studying. Now what that means is it's not necessarily that because you are in year 11 or in year 13 you're an expert learner in all of the topics that you're studying. If it's a new topic and you don't have a lot of background knowledge on that topic, you haven't done a lot on it before, you are a novice. And there's a few reasons why I'm saying that explicit instruction is most effective for novice learners. The first is all to do with cognitive architecture and cognitive load. And so I'll just explain what I mean by that. So cognitive architecture is all about our memories, and the fact that if we look at the cognitive science model of memory, we've got our working memory where we process new information, but that is really limited in capacity. And then we've got our long-term memory, which is basically infinite in how much we can store in the long-term memory. And that learning occurs when we move information from our working memories over to our long-term memories so that it can be recalled in the future. But, and I'm sure everyone listening to the podcast will know this, but if we overload our working memory, if we place too much demand on that working memory and ask it to process too much information at once, it becomes overloaded. And then that transfer of that new information from the working memory to the long-term memory is hindered, and we obviously don't learn that. And we'll all have taught lessons where students have really struggled, and we've maybe asked them to do too many steps at once, and then they can't remember how to do whatever we're asking them to do, or we've given them too much information, new knowledge at once, and then they forget some of it. And that's because we've overloaded their working memories. And what we see with explicit instruction is because it's very teacher-led, and because you are breaking things down, you're always thinking about the amount of load that you're putting on learners, and therefore it's more effective. Now, if we contrast that with discovery learning, when we are using discovery learning, pupils have to hold lots and lots of information in their heads at once. They have to hold all of the things they're trying to try, what they've tried so far, where they're trying to get to, and that places much more load on the working memory, and so is more likely to lead to that cognitive overload and then hinder learning. So that's the kind of first reason. And then the second reason, and it's linked to that, is that novices and experts learn differently. Now, when we're an expert, we have transferred that working memory into our long-term memory. So we've got a really good schema, we would call it, of knowledge about a certain topic or how to perform a certain skill in our long-term memories. And then when we then bring that back into our working memories to use it, because we actually need to remember that now, we need to think about that content, it only takes up one chunk in the working memory. So it doesn't cause anywhere near as much load as it would do for a novice learner. And again, for that reason, we need to make sure that we're trying to be as explicit and guided as possible for novice learners so that they don't experience that overload.
Okay, so like I said, that's the reason why explicit instruction is likely to be much more effective for novice learners. And then I think we can also look at the other issues with discovery learning, where we've asked students to work out new information for themselves, or to work out how to solve a problem or perform a particular skill by themselves. And we'll all have done this, and you can see that there's often cognitive overload, that maybe there's misconceptions because people think they've done it in the right way or solved the problem in the correct way or discovered this new knowledge, and then they haven't, and it's something that you actually have to correct. It takes more time, and it can be more motivating if pupils struggle to kind of discover the right content for themselves. So for me, explicit instruction is a really big win. And then I think my last kind of point here, I'll just clarify the kind of strategies that I think are included in explicit instruction, because your definitions and strategies will differ. So for me, it is chunking, so breaking complex material into small chunks and only introducing a small chunk of new information or a small part of a skill to pupils in one go. It is making sure that your explanations are clear and concise, so you've really thought about as a teacher, what do the students need to know, and what's the most concise way that I can tell them that. You've used examples to make things concrete. You've used non-examples or worked examples if that's appropriate. I'll then say modelling, including teacher-led modelling as a class, deconstruction of exemplar material or example pieces of work, scaffolding for complex tasks, so writing frames, structure strips, all that kind of thing, and then extended practice, moving from fully guided practice, where you are using that scaffolding, and then using guidance fading to kind of reduce that over time until we get to lots and lots of independent practice. And that's it for that tip.
Fantastic. Right, let's dive into this a little bit. Now, I'm a big explicit instruction fan, but I'm going to play the role of devil's advocate here, Jade. So we'll see if we can dive into this, because every time I chat about explicit instruction with reference to maths, I get the same questions back. Mm-hmm. So I never have good answers. So let me hit you with these questions and see what you come up with.
I'm sure that's not true. But
so the first thing is, like, you often get like discovery learning. Very rarely, certainly in maths anyway, do you see the way it's sometimes presented in research papers. Very, very rarely. Well, sometimes it's held up as this thing where the kids just have to kind of figure everything out for themselves. Whereas what you see in maths, and I'm interested if this is true in your subject, is it's more kind of inquiry based, in the sense that students are allowed to struggle for a little bit, then perhaps the teacher comes in with a bit of prompt and a support, and often that's delivered quite explicitly, and then it's a little bit more struggle, can they get to the next part on their own, and then followed up by a bit more kind of teacher kind of guided instruction and so on and so forth. I think that's the kind of thing that I see more than the kind of, I guess, pure version of discovery learning. Would that be true in your subject, and would that also be problematic in your eyes?
So I agree that that's probably what we see more, and that's because I think as teachers we don't want students to struggle unproductively for too long, which is probably the right thing to do. We only have a limited amount of time. And there's a difference between, I think, struggling because you're thinking really hard about a task or some content, and kind of struggling on your own because you actually don't know what to do. And they're two very different things. So I'd say, first of all, that's a distinction that needs to be made really clear. Explicit instruction isn't making everything really easy for the pupils. It's being explicit about what the new content is. And actually, I found that when you introduce new content using explicit instruction, you've then got more time to move on to more challenging material as a class together. And I would say that is still problematic, because it still has the issues of that pure form of discovery learning, where if you're allowing students to struggle, let's say in maths, and you say, how do you think you might solve this problem? Yeah. Some of your brightest kids will be able to work that out for themselves. They, especially with your helps, if they're struggling for a bit and then we help them, and then they're struggling for a bit and then we help them, eventually they will work out the right answer. Not all your children will be able to do that, and the ones that are least likely to do that are those who maybe find the subject more difficult, aren't as able, etc. And they're the ones that explicit instruction would benefit the most. So I think that's probably based on a really common myth that explicit instruction is, I'm just going to tell you everything and you're not going to have to think about it. When it's not that. It's, I'm going to introduce you to the new content, and then we're going to do loads practice. But I don't mean practice as in solving the same equation again and again. I mean, we're going to look at, I'm business studies and economics, so it might be, we're going to look at how this looks at in different countries. How does this look in different countries? How does it look in different businesses? We're really going to analyse the benefits and the drawbacks and the evaluations. So I think it kind of allows you to get into much more challenging content and much more depth if you introduce any skills or knowledge explicitly from the start.
Got it. Good answer. Right, two more awkward ones for you. So next one, I don't know if you're familiar with the research into productive failure, but this is always the kind of thorn in my side when I'm chatting about this. So for the benefit of listeners who aren't aware of this, productive failure is the notion that you essentially give kids a question that they cannot do. They haven't got the knowledge to do it yet. But the fact that they struggle with it for 5 minutes or whatever it is means that when you then do teach them it explicitly, they take it in a bit more, almost as if the theory suggests they've been primed to it. They've already started to kind of activate parts of relevant knowledge in long-term memory and so on and so forth. What's your take on productive failure as an approach? I find it problematic, but I'm interested in your view.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I would think, I can see where the idea behind that would work, in that you've started to think about, well, actually, what do I know about this topic already, and how can I then use that to solve the problem? I think I would just do that through recapping prior knowledge, prerequisite knowledge, whether that be through retrieval practice or you explaining it, or looking at, well, what have we done previously? And again, I probably don't think there's anything wrong with that if you're doing that for a short amount of time. You know, you said 5 minutes and then you explicitly explain. Because 5 minutes, one, you're not wasting too much lesson time, but also you're not going to enable pupils to really develop and embed any of those serious misconceptions. So I can see how that would work, and I think if it is that kind of 5 minutes, it's probably less of an issue. But certainly, I would just reactivate their prior knowledge, I suppose.
Yeah, I think I would too, to be honest. Right, here's your last one. So this is awkward. So we know that. Well, we think that explicit instruction is particularly effective for novice learners, and then you get this kind of expertise reversal effect where once they become a bit more expert, we give them less guided instruction and so on. So I guess the big question is, when do we switch? When do students go from being novice to expert?
Yeah, really good question, and it's not something you can quantify, because you can't say, well, when they've got a certain amount of questions right, or when they've. I think this is where the role of the teacher in research informed practice is so important, because you have to use your professional judgment as a teacher, and you've got to think, do they now have a good amount of knowledge about this topic? And I think you can do it through that guidance fading. So you know, you've done lots and lots of examples together, let's say, or you've modelled, and then they've done some together, they've done some part completion questions. Once they reach a point where they can independently recite that knowledge, explain that knowledge, show understanding, or perform a skill, etc., without that guidance and that scaffolding, probably then.
Got it. Fantastic.